In this, the final part of our look back at the collapse of the British car industry, we begin in 1988 with the sale of the Rover Group to British Aerospace, finally taking the ailing automaker out of the hands of the UK government for the first time since 1975, and giving both the workforce, management and backers cause for jubilation and a secure future. The Rover Group's directors immediately developing a new business plan that would garner profits of £300 million per year so as to fund the replacement of the many rapidly aging models of the product lineup, namely cars such as the dwindling Montego and Maestro, although with the removal of Rover from the public sector, the media circus that had long surrounded the car maker since its formation into British Leyland 20 years earlier rapidly evaporated, and now the company was granted the opportunity to revise its range without facing the scrutiny of the national press, the most important thing for the company now being a strong fiscal commitment by BAE in order to ensure this new business plan was brought to fruition. However, British Aerospace itself was exceptionally cost-hungry, as aside from building commercial airliners such as the BAE 146 regional jet, the Jetstream regional turboprop, and the advanced turboprop airliner, the firm was also committed to developing a new generation of fighter in the form of the Experimental Aircraft Program, or EAP, which would ultimately lead to the Eurofighter Typhoon of 1994, the only consistent profit made for BAE at this time being its continued support of the Airbus multinational airliner company of France, in which it provided aircraft wings and components for their ever-widening array of commercial jets, the costs of which were subsidised by the UK government. BAE's own unstable financial situation, as well as its lack of experience in the field of mass production automaking, seeing rival car companies immediately noting that, despite the spike in stock prices and the boost in corporate morale at Rover, the long-term benefits likely to be reaped by their ownership would be minimal at best, as demonstrated through various cheaper alternatives to whole-scale replacements to the likes of the Metro, Maestro and Montego, with a proposed Metro successor being scaled down to merely a facelift, while a replacement model for the Montego, dubbed the AR9, was dropped as it neared the end of its development process, British Aerospace instead deciding that improvements to the range should be based more on an image refresh rather than a full overhaul of the product lineup, culminating in the R17 facelift during 1991, wherein the Rover 200, 400 and 800 were aesthetically upgraded to include a smoother profile, a more luxurious interior, and the addition of a new badge and grille that would harken back to the days of the classic Rover P5 of the 1960s, this move following the philosophy of Chairman Graham Day in that the Rover mark should be endeared towards a more upmarket clientele, including business managers and leaders of industry. This isn't to say that Rover Group's tenure under British Aerospace didn't produce results, as despite the company starting off initially with a huge stumble, as per its failed attempt to return to the American market by way of the Sterling project, a variant of the Rover 800 designed for the United States that proved to be a huge failure and was axed after only 3 years in circulation, the new Rover 200 R8 facelift of 1989 was a massive success on the domestic market, and gave rise to the exceptionally striking Rover 200 Coupe that was among the most popular sports cars on sale in Britain, with the turbo editions being the fastest Rover products ever built in the company's history, while the Land Rover division continued to be Rover's biggest profit maker, with the Range Rover, after its official launch in the United States during March 1987, seeing phenomenal success that resulted in Range Rover dealers jumping from an initial 36 in 1987 to 65 by 1988. The Range Rover, despite its own endemic build quality and reliability concerns, holding a somewhat unique position as the only dedicated luxury SUV on sale at the time. American equivalents such as the Jeep Wagoneer essentially being regular family sedans with four-wheel drive transmission and added ride height, while the likes of the Mercedes-Benz G-Class wouldn't venture into the luxury SUV market bracket until 1989 at the earliest, which was complemented that year by the launch of the Land Rover Discovery that provided a much-needed bridge between the exclusive Range Rover and the utilitarian Land Rover Defender, and was a huge commercial success among families as the must-have car for the notorious school run. However, the success of the latest Rover 200, which was based on the platform and drivetrain of the Honda Concerto, together with its saloon variant, the Rover 400, and the Honda Legend-based executive Rover 800, set the direction of British Aerospace's management of the Rover Group in that, so as to save on costs, the firm should base as many of its models as possible on Honda underpinnings in order to allow for ease of parts sharing, while halving the expense of developing machines from the ground up, a highly economical solution, but one that was incredibly unsustainable in the long term, exemplified further in June 1989 with the announcement of the Rover 600 Saloon, which would owe pretty much every piece of its construction to the upcoming Honda Accord for 1992, the problem being that the Accord was very much designed specifically for Honda's own use, and thus was inflexible to the revised engineering for license-built derivatives, thereby meaning that the Rover 600 would require Honda engines, suspension units, and interior trim, but with some leeway as to the exterior, which could be customized to suit the profile of Rover Group's general aesthetic. While during its bid to continue moving the Rover marque further up market, essentially providing Mercedes-Benz and Jaguar luxury at half the price, the British Aerospace management, through the advisement of Honda, refused to surrender all aspects of the mass production division, despite the fact that they were querying the exclusive pitch of the corporate direction set by Graham Day. BAE insistent that mass production cars like the Mini, Metro, Maestro and Montego remain in production so as to make as much money as possible in the short term, regardless of the fact that the Maestro and Montego were now dead in the water commercially, hanging from the product lineup and selling in sporadic numbers. At the same time, an investigation by the European Commission was launched in mid-1990 so as to determine the terms of the Rover Group's sale to British Aerospace, with the conclusion being that the £150 million buyout was far below the company's worth, and, in collaboration with a separate investigation conducted by the National Audit Office, or NAO, the watchdog of the British Parliament's own financial dealings, found that the sale of Rover Group had been improperly managed and rushed to finalisation with a severely undervalued sales figure, while at the same time writing off £2.6 billion worth of debt, when in actuality the debt of the firm stood at around £3.457 billion. An independent evaluation made by the Bearings Assessment Management on behalf of the Department of Trade and Industry during 1988, also revealing that, with all debts removed, the company had a value of at least £950 million. British Aerospace having recouped at least £126 million of the original £150 million sum within a year thanks to their purchase of a 40% share in the DAF Truck Company, which netted between £40 and £50 million, and the sale of their computer services company, Istel, for £39.1 million. The NAO concluding that Rover, at the time of sale, was actually worth £206.5 million with debts included, and that the sale to British Aerospace had been unfairly underpriced so as to reduce the amount spent by the nationalised aerospace company. Though the revelations of the NAO and European Commission inquiries led to something of a scandal during 1991, the Rover Group continued to maintain a modest profit, though this was only by virtue of the incredible limits on spending being implemented by British Aerospace, much of which, as mentioned, involved simply sharing as many parts and platforms with contemporary Honda products, a circumstance that led to the same questions being asked by the buying public a decade earlier, when the Rover 600 saloon was eventually launched in 1993, whereby the number of parts shared between the 600 and its Honda Accord progenitor meant there was barely a discernible difference that would warrant the premium being paid by customers for the Rover when compared to the equivalent Honda, while bespoke developments, including an innovative crossover SUV that would sit below the Discovery, known as the Land Rover Pathfinder, together with further Metro replacement proposals, were axed early on despite their commercial potential, with other more successful developments, such as the MG-F, a prospective revival of the famous MG marque on its own dedicated model, being created on little to no budget and essentially put together in the spare time of Rover engineers, while at the same time, BAE stacked their own bank accounts by moving all Rover car production at the Cowley plant into the original pressed steel Fisher facility, with the original production lines being sold off for real estate development, and 2/3 of the Canley factory was shut down to save on expenses as well. The stripping of these assets being done following a change of management in 1992, when Professor Smith retired as chairman of British Aerospace, and thus meant his promise to not sell off the various aspects of the Rover Group, as per the stipulations of the original 1988 purchase deal, were no longer respected. BAE more eager to use the sale of Rover assets to help bolster their own precarious finances in the wake of falling sales for their range of jet and turboprop airliners, as well as the commercial bomb that was the BAE ATP. By 1993, it was very clear that British Aerospace had lost its long-term interest in supporting the Rover Group, and were now running down the clock as to the 5-year minimum stewardship of the company before selling it on at the first opportunity, this being reflected in the condition of the forward planning department at Rover, which mimicked the dark days of BMC prior to the merger to form British Leyland, in that there were only 2 models in the pipeline for release in the mid-1990s, the MG-F sports car and a facelifted version of the Range Rover dubbed the P38, the fresh face and executive image of the Rover Group hiding a thoroughly decrepit corporation that was desperately hidden by BAE's new chairman, John Cahill, who offered the car builder for purchase in late 1993 in a manner that wouldn't give the impression that they were simply offloading Rover with all possible haste, a buyer soon emerging in the form of German carmaker BMW, which was facing its own long-term dilemma, as while the Munich-based firm was renowned for its sports saloons, luxury cars and grand tourers, the company was struggling to compete with its fellow Teutonic auto builders at Volkswagen and Mercedes-Benz due to a lack of low-end models that appealed to the mass market, thus resulting in BMW output standing at less than 1 million cars per year, and thereby making it the smallest of Germany's mainstream car manufacturers. The new company's CEO, Bernd Pichetsrieder, considering that, in order to ensure the long-term survivability of BMW, the company would need to provide models that appeal to the mass market in a similar manner to Volkswagen, but would not dilute the prestigious brand reputation that BMW had garnered itself with cars like the 3 Series, 5 Series, 7 Series and 8 Series. The purchase of Rover Group, therefore, provided an easy solution, as it meant that mass production could be delegated to the British shadow company, while BMW could maintain its prestige, as well as inheriting the Range Rover marque, which, by this point, was so renowned in the world of luxury cars that it essentially shared the same segment as bespoke affluent motors like Rolls-Royce and Bentley. Rover's face value image illustrating many distinct qualities, such as the Mini, the Range Rover, and the MG marque, as well as 2 of the largest assembly plants in Europe in the form of Longbridge and Cowley, and thus led Pichetsrieder to meet Rover Group chairman George Simpson in June 1993, eventually coming to an arrangement that stipulated that BMW would purchase Rover in its entirety, although not all parties were pleased with this new direction, as many management figures within the Rover Group considered that the purchase of the company by an outside firm would engender job losses and factory closures, with managing director John Towers preferring instead that Rover be sold to Honda, who already possessed a 20% share of the company and had an in-depth corporate relationship with the British carmaker, although Honda, perfectly aware of the actual position Rover was in by late 1993, showed no interest in purchasing the company outright, only offering to increase their stake in the firm to 47.5%. Last-minute attempts to try and endear the company to Honda, even down to the night before the deal was meant to be signed, being met with ambivalence by Honda's CEO, Nobuhiko Kawamoto, who would not even greet Rover's George Simpson personally and left it to his financial director to reaffirm their position as to purchasing a minority share and nothing more. Thus, with no competitors to BMW's £800 million offer for the Rover Group, the deal was signed on January 31, 1994, and Britain's last volume car manufacturer fell into the hands of the Germans, industry observers being surprised by the move, as they were fully of the conviction that Rover would ultimately seek to closen ties with Honda, Pichetsrieder announcing the following day his company's purchase of Rover at a press event held in Munich, ensuring that Rover's future would be secure by promising inward investment rooted to Longbridge and Cowley, and that there would be no plant closures, despite the fact that BMW's previous management, who had made an offer to buy British Leyland in the late 1970s, stated their intention to immediately close the Longbridge plant. BMW taking a hands-off attitude to the running of Rover by allowing them a certain degree of autonomy to best suit their market position. This coming down to the manufacturing of their cars, designing new models, marketing, and other corporate aspects. The BMW executives being pleased as to the initial direction of the Rover Group, with their upcoming Rover 200 hatchback, Rover 400 small family car, and MG-F, which were being readied for entry into production. BMW setting the priorities for the Rover Group's forward planning as to refreshing the Mini by way of creating a dedicated brand for the model, alongside a new car that would be tailored to the market of the 1990s, and using it to replace the Metro in the lineup, while the Maestro and Montego would be removed from sales and replaced by 2 new family models dubbed the Rover R30 and R40, the larger Rover 600 and 800 executive saloons, ultimately being amalgamated into a new car called the Rover 75, all of these models expected for launch by the end of the decade. At the same time, the Land Rover Pathfinder project was revived to form the basis of the Land Rover Freelander, with body construction outsourced to the Finnish company Valmet, due to a lack of assembly space at Land Rover's own Solihull plant near Birmingham. This move being the main reason as to why British Aerospace had axed the Pathfinder scheme in its entirety back in 1990, while Pichetsrieder's eagerness to inject funds and transform the Rover Group into a Renaissance brand, even going so far as to potentially resurrect long-dormant marques that were lost during the dark era of British Leyland, including Riley and Austin Healey, the outlook for Rover being so great that morale and confidence in the future of the firm reached fever pitch, with management figures at the company being made up of British CEOs and other executives who were more attuned to the needs of the marketplace and workforce, Pichetsrieder's attitude being to leave the running of Rover to the men who knew it best and keep interference to a minimum so as not to stir animosity. Sadly, within 2 years, the reality of what BMW had inherited became apparent, as despite mountains of funds being injected into the Rover Group so as to bring the Mini, R30, R40 and Rover 75 to fruition, very little progress had been made, their model lineup still very much being the same Honda-based products that had been present at the buyout, and the replacement cars undergoing development at Gaydon not being treated with the sense of urgency so as to allow for the withdrawal of the 16-year-old Metro and the 10-year-old Rover 800, the reversal in fortunes truly beginning when John Towers, who had been elevated to Rover CEO in 1994, resigned from his position with a £500,000 payoff, meaning that, with no British executives being of suitable experience or rank to fill his shoes, Dr. Wolfgang Reitzler, a manager at BMW, was called in to become CEO of the Rover Group, the first instance of a senior position at the British firm being filled by a member of the German team. This move being only temporary, as the role was eventually handed to fellow BMW manager Walter Hasselkuss, his appointment coming at a time when Pichetsrider was truly beginning to drive the Rover Group towards an image that was fundamentally British, and thereby dispel the commonly held perception that all Rovers were merely rebadged Hondas, though this required a blanket replacement of the pre-existing Rover 200, 400, 600 and 800. As with these cars still maintaining Honda underpinnings, BMW was forced to pay exorbitant royalty payments to the Japanese builder so as to continue using their parts and platforms. Pichetsrider's determination to make the Rover brand quintessentially British, while done with the best intentions, was unfortunately a move that did not consider the tastes of the modern car buyer, especially with regard to the market segment Rover was attempting to appeal to, endearing the firm to conservative British aesthetics that completely eschewed younger aspirational buyers, such as families, rising businessmen, and people working in the financial sector, a market segment that BMW itself had successfully appealed to since the early 1980s. While those people who were buying Rover products were generally of an older clientele, drawn to the wood veneer, leather upholstery, and cosseting comfort of machines built to harken back to the grand old days of the Rover P5 and SD1, essentially bending the upmarket image as proposed by Graham Day into a caricature of itself, and creating a range of cars that were essentially ye olde English theme parks on wheels, BMW's long-term ambitions being to have a three-rank segment occupied by the firms under its control, Rover appealing to a low-end mass-production market, as well as an entry-level executive market with the upcoming Rover 75, BMW selling squarely to the executive bracket with sports saloons and luxury cars that incorporated a performance edge, while the ultra-luxury segment would be satisfied by their purchase of the Rolls-Royce brand during 1998. Sadly, the Rover Group's research centre in Gaydon near Warwick continued to drag its feet as to the development of the Rover 75, Mini and Rover R30, meaning that BMW had to take an increasingly direct involvement in the operations at Gaydon so as to ensure that the future models would be delivered in a timely manner, while at the same time, reliability on Rover's products slumped dramatically towards the middle of the decade, with what was formerly the Metro, now dubbed the Rover 100, being of such poor quality that it was only selling because of its fuel economy alone, while the Land Rover division illustrated by far the worst of reliability concerns, as the Land Rover Discovery, and more prominently the brand new Range Rover P38, often topped consumer survey charts as having the poorest build quality and endemic faults. So much so that, in the case of the P38, the number of problems regarding the car's fundamental design meant an entirely new Range Rover had to be developed from the ground up so as to replace it as soon as possible. Pichetsrider's hands-off approach, by 1997, being questioned with great intensity by the BMW senior management in Munich, who believed that allowing Rover such plentiful amounts of money and no real oversight from their German parent firm had led to them picking up a plethora of bad habits, not helped by the lack of investment provided by British Aerospace, which left many members of the company board believing that the Rover Group had been damaged beyond repair, and that at least one of the two remaining production facilities in the UK, Cowley and Longbridge, should be closed immediately in order to focus mass assembly on the upcoming Mini and Rover R30 projects, these proposals being opposed vehemently by Pichetsrider, who intended to keep the promise he'd made to the British government in 1994, despite the fact that the numbers only served to support the BMW company board's vocal concerns, with Rover's market share having dropped to a mere 10.9% in the UK, while the firm continued to make severe losses year on year. With ever-increasing frustration, BMW managers were seconded to Gaydon to try and push along development of the upcoming models, and by the end of the year it was indeed apparent that Rover had lost all its autonomy, now being but a shadow firm in the expanding BMW empire, slashing confidence among the workforce and giving the feeling that the Teutonic motoring giant, like so many others before, would attempt to offload the firm in the near future. BMW having no real gain from its ownership of Rover, as it struggled to manage costs while injecting upwards of £800 million per year into the ailing car maker. This money essentially being used to plug the various underinvestments made during the British Aerospace era, including the creation of a new engine factory at Hams Hall, a refurbishment of the Gaydon Research Centre, modernising the assembly facilities at Longbridge and Cowley, and also delivering 5 new products that were no closer to launch than they had been 2 years earlier: the R30, the Rover 75, the new Mini, the Land Rover Freelander, and the Range Rover P38 replacement, the L322, all while Rover's productivity topped out at 500,000 cars per year, and forecasts, based on an absolute best-case scenario of the Rover 75 and new Mini being a success, as well as there being no economic recessions or general slowdowns in car sales, showed that the company wouldn't break even until 2000 at the earliest, only serving to fuel the rampant irritations of the BMW senior staff. Though there was a brief hope that Chrysler of America may have formed a joint venture with BMW to produce new engines for Rover from a factory in Brazil, these were rapidly dashed when Daimler-Benz saw the motions of a potential buyout of the American car builder by BMW and thus swept in to purchase Chrysler in May 1998, circumventing a potential BMW-Chrysler partnership by way of creating the new $55 billion Daimler-Chrysler combine, meaning the task of getting Rover back into profit was once again solely on the shoulders of BMW, who clung to the possibility that the Rover 75, R30 and new Mini may just be the market barnstormers needed to get the crumbling British car firm back on track. Though realistically, the loss of the Chrysler tie-up was merely the beginning of a downward spiral, the Mini project having been delayed from a 1999 launch date to a 2000 and later 2001 launch date due to various development problems, the Rover 100 being forced out of sales following a disastrous Euro NCAP crash test, during which the 19-year-old machine scored 1 out of a possible 5 stars for safety, thus making it unacceptably dangerous to sell, and following the UK dropping out of the exchange rate mechanism in 1992, the pound sterling lacked stability when compared to the Deutschmark, thereby meaning that when the pound rose sharply against the Deutschmark during 1997, a fiscal crisis of currency exchange would strip BMW of a large portion of its profits, meaning that, for UK buyers, a strong pound allowed for products to be sold for less, but with profits remaining unchanged for the foreign company, or could remain static but with increased profits for said company, while at the same time having the counter effect of requiring Rover products sold abroad to be retailed at a higher price in Europe, and thereby slash the already meagre export market for the firm, BMW having no choice but to increase their market share in the UK through additional dealers so as to counter the forecast loss of profits, though this influx of import models meant Rover's market share slumped to a mere 8.6%, currency fluctuations and the aging volume models seeing sales for the Rover Group vanish, and BMW's continued investments becoming impossible to justify. Amid BMW having to cut 1,500 jobs from its own firm, as well as implementing a 4-day week on other aspects so as to save on salaries, Pichetsrider was now seen in the eyes of both the German and British public as the face of all the problems at both Rover and BMW. The frustrations of this, combined with a corporate revolt being orchestrated by his former second-in-command, Wolfgang Reitzler, so as to remove him from the position of CEO, came to a head at the launch of the Rover 75 in late 1998, when he took the opportunity to give a speech criticising the British government for its anti-Euro policy, and openly questioned whether there was any future at all for the staff at Longbridge, a public relations fiasco that not only drew the ire of Parliament, but also collapsed any confidence felt within the ranks of the workforce in the West Midlands. Pichetsrider's reasoning as to this shock announcement being simply to try and get the trade unions to accept upcoming job losses at Longbridge, and thereby free up funding to finish the Longbridge refurbishment and get the Rover R30 into production. This move single-handedly putting the last nail in the coffin for BMW's involvement in the Rover Group, with Walter Hasselkuss resigning as chairman and chief executive of Rover on December 2nd of the same year, due to his correct foresight as to the hopelessness of the situation, while in the midst of requesting upward of £2 billion worth of further investment for both the day-to-day operation of Rover, alongside refurbishing the Longbridge plant and getting both the Mini and Rover R30 into production. Pichetsrider faced an outright rebuff from the British government when he requested £200 million of state subsidy due to his earlier comments at the Rover 75 launch, ultimately leading to an antagonistic stalemate that was only resolved by direct intervention of UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. Inevitably, Pichetsrider was on his last chance when it came to ensuring BMW's continued involvement in the Rover Group, and on February 5, 1999, put forward to the BMW Supervisory Board in Munich, together with chairman of BMW and his predecessor as company CEO, Eberhard von Kuenheim, a recovery plan for Rover that would cost £1.4 billion and be delivered over the course of 6 years, restructuring the product lineup so that all new models would be derived from 2 basic platforms, with the range of cars including, in descending order, the Rover 75, the Rover 55, the Rover 35, the new Mini, and a proposed crossover SUV dubbed the Rover TCV. Although while some elements of the BMW board approved this plan, von Kuenheim, under pressure from BMW's backers, together with Volkswagen making motions as to potentially taking over the company due to its volatile fiscal situation, was forced to turn down the proposal due to its cost and lengthy timescale, leaving Pichetsrider no choice but to resign, and thereby seeing his 5-year efforts to revive the Rover Group go up in smoke. Although despite him being tipped as the obvious choice for CEO, Pichetsrider's resignation was followed half an hour later by the resignation of his rival Wolfgang Reitzler, as in a hung vote within the company board of 6 for and 6 against appointing him to the rank. Von Kuenheim, who held the winning vote, abstained, as he could not support a man who had rocked the BMW corporate boat for such a long time, causing Reitzler to walk out in disgust, meaning that, after a day of the firm being essentially leaderless, and with managers at Porsche and Mercedes-Benz being cold-called by the media as speculative candidates for the takeover of BMW, the position eventually went to BMW's production chief, Joachim Milberg, during the late hours of that evening. With Milberg now in charge, he was determined to pull Rover into line no matter what, as illustrated when he placed into the position of Rover chairman Professor Werner Samann, a tough, no-nonsense figure in the motor industry who appeared to be the right man to make difficult decisions, even if they required job losses and factory cuts. His first move within days of his appointment being to send dozens of BMW executives to Gaydon so as to strip down the research division and implement an efficient, strictly controlled working environment that would produce the results necessary to deliver the R30 and the new Mini. These groups of managers being dubbed purge teams and had very quickly displaced much of the former British staff at the facility with German counterparts. Samann stating openly his support of Britain joining the recently introduced euro currency so as to remove the stronger pound sterling from the equation and end the exchange crisis going on between Germany and Britain, all while Milberg, now CEO of BMW, outlined a somewhat less grandiose version of Pitcher Strider's own long-term plan for Rover, which would instead centre solely around the R30, which would be translated into both a BMW version of the car called the 2 Series and 3 British variants known as the Land Rover Explorer, the Mini Maxi, and the MG Mini Sprite, all 3 to be sold as niche models that would command a high enough premium to enable production volumes of 400,000 cars per annum so as to break even, though this would require at least £200 million in state subsidies from the British government, which, due to the hesitancy of the UK Treasury, saw Milberg make threats as to closing the Longbridge factory completely and moving all production for the R30 to a new plant in Hungary. After much debate, and with the then Trade Secretary Stephen Byers inadvertently misleading Milberg into believing the government had committed to a £180 million regional state aid, the eventual sum, as determined by Prime Minister Tony Blair, came to a dismal £129 million, which would then be topped up by the Birmingham Chamber of Commerce to a total of £152 million, far too low to bring the R30 to fruition, and breaking all confidence that the British government would commit to supporting the Rover Group, leading immediately to an exit plan being drafted by BMW during August 1999, a potential buyer appearing soon afterwards in the form of Alchemy, a venture capital company established by businessmen John Moulton and Eric Walters, who were on the lookout for a new investment project for which they could reverse its fortunes and make a profit, as had been the case previously with the Fads chain of DIY stores during 1997. The two men observing that, based on its dire situation, BMW may have been in a position to surrender ownership of the Rover Group to them in order to allow them the opportunity to turn it around, despite the fact that they had neither the capital nor the experience to run a car firm, their audacious attitude to the matter leading them, in September 1999, to make an offer to take Rover off BMW's hands, arguing that, with the launch of the BMW X5 during the same month, which was the builder's first SUV and had been based on technical information gathered through their ownership of Land Rover, there was no need for them to hang on to this particular brand, nor was there any reason for them to keep hold of Rover in general, as the BMW mark had proven itself to be strong enough to move downward in the auto market without becoming unrecognizable, putting to BMW in no uncertain terms that, based on the near collapse of the firm for the 1997-1998 fiscal year, and with no sign of recovery getting any closer, the German builder should offload Rover as fast as they could, or risk being dragged under alongside it. BMW were immediately interested in Alchemy's offer, as in the face of Rover's still disastrous finances, there was no chance at all that a large car firm or holding company would want to take on such a calamitous firm, or, at the very least, without purchasing a large chunk of BMW stock alongside to compensate for Rover's own lack of value. And with time ticking on and money continuing to be lost, the Teutonic giant began making motions as to selling Rover to Alchemy during the autumn of 1999, all while giving the outward impression that they remained fully committed to its future and would deliver the R30 for the 2002 model year. The eventual business plan for the Alchemy takeover being that Alchemy would purchase the Longbridge factory and the production rights to the original 1959 Mini, the Rover 25, the Rover 45, the Rover 75, and the MGF, which would remain on sale until such time as a new model range could be developed, while BMW would retain the Cowley plant in order to produce the new Mini, and the Hams Hall engine factory in order to produce power units for the Mini range, the final suggestion, as proposed by Alchemy, being to sell off Land Rover to a third party so as to recover some of the investment ploughed into Longbridge and Cowley over the preceding 6 years, Alchemy being awarded a 6-week period of due diligence in order for them to be given full access to Rover's books, so as to lay out a detailed financial plan, the announcement from BMW coming the following day that Rover would be sold to the Alchemy partnership, and its various aspects would be broken up, Land Rover being sold to the highest bidder, which soon came to pass as the Ford Motor Company, BMW retaining the Cowley plant and the production rights to the upcoming new Mini, and Alchemy guaranteeing the continued sale of the Rover 75, with assembly moved to the Longbridge plant, which would also become the heart of their operations, the venture capitalist firm stating their intention to promote the MG mark wherever possible, and thus renaming the Rover Group, with immediate effect, to the MG Car Company. The result was an outright scandal across the UK industry, with blame being placed on all parties as to the dire situation of the Rover Group, regardless of the fact that its current situation was the product of decades of mismanagement and corporate inefficiency, while in order to stop the purchase of Rover by the Alchemy partnership, a counterbid was prepared by four major players in the West Midlands called Phoenix Venture Holdings Limited, which was headed by former Rover Group Managing Director John Towers, businessman Peter Beale, non-executive director of Lola Cars Nick Stevenson, and Rover dealer principal director John Edwards, with local Liberal Democrat MP John Hemming being tasked with rallying businessmen and politicians into accepting this alternative to Alchemy's proposal. Towers promoting himself as the better option due to his previous experience working within the ranks of Rover, and was even able to woo the Department of Trade and Industry by stating that, rather than ditching the Rover brand, he considered it to still have value and would work to try and keep it going as a volume car mark, a direct contradiction to Alchemy's proposal to scrap Rover and simply focus on the MG name. John Edwards, thanks to his influence across the West Midlands car scene, being able to encourage 20 dealers to invest in the Phoenix Consortium and contribute financially to their counter bid. The dealers even going so far as to sue BMW for damages, as they had been promised sale of the new Mini upon its launch, but were now to be cut out of the venture in its entirety, a fact exploited by Towers in order to drum up support, while Hemming travelled the West Midlands and Britain on a highly publicised political campaign to support the Phoenix Consortium, and even suggested that Towers attempt to pry the Mini mark from BMW's hands in order to keep it within Rover's sphere of influence, although he eventually concluded that conceding Mini to BMW would cut the potential buyout price for the Rover Group overall, while Tony Woodley, a major figure in the trade unions, directly contacted Hemming to provide a substantial financial sum that even caught the attention of BMW's company board, and now presented the Phoenix Consortium as a viable alternative to the Alchemy partnership that required no major investment from venture capitalists. Nick Stevenson, as an executive at Lola Cars, and a man who had attempted his own buyout of MG from BMW during 1999, using his influence within the industry to provide the consortium with manufacturing expertise through engineering and technical staff, thereby giving the counterbid some real teeth that, from BMW's perspective, only needed the formal lodging of their own buyout deal to sink the plans of the Alchemy partnership. Hemming offering Joachim Milberg a nominal payment for the Rover Group against Alchemy's £50 million offer on March 27, 2000. But due to the exclusive 6-week due diligence period awarded to Alchemy, the Phoenix Consortium could not have access to Rover's internal finances and was essentially buying the company blind. What Alchemy was privy to, and the Phoenix Consortium was not, was the fact that Rover's fiscal situation was comprised of a complex rabbit warren of contractual agreements with the suppliers, dealers and workforce that meant, should the deal go ahead, Alchemy would be left wide open to legal and industrial action. The period of due diligence ending on April 28, 2000, although in the face of their findings, and the sheer magnitude of the task presented to them based on Rover's financial condition, meant that the day before, Alchemy's directors, Moulton and Waters, met with BMW's solicitors to outline their concerns, which included the possibility of industrial and legal action due to BMW's failure to give the unions an acceptable advanced warning of their impending plans to dispose of Rover, and the fact that BMW would only guarantee to pay the statutory minimum redundancy payments to the 4,000 employees that Alchemy planned to lay off, even though Moulton knew that, in order to avert crippling strike action, the severance pay offer needed to be substantially higher, the Alchemy director stating that his firm would need an extra £100 million on top of the original £500 million payment tabled to BMW in order to take Rover off their hands, which, in combination with BMW requiring that Alchemy guarantee £1 billion worth of loans to the Rover distribution network, meant the sum was far too much for the Alchemy partnership to muster, and the deal immediately collapsed, leaving the Phoenix Consortium a clean slate on which to broker a deal with BMW that was formalised on May 2, 2000, through the offering of £500 million to take over the Rover Group, despite the fact that John Towers continued to remain aloof as to how his consortium would find the financial backing to pay for such a monumental agreement. The government, through the medium of Stephen Byers, enlisting city analysts with knowledge of the motor industry to evaluate the deal in order to gauge whether Phoenix could drum up the funds through car production alone, with the general consensus being that, even with a production output of 200,000 cars per year, Phoenix simply wouldn't be able to survive without direct government intervention further down the line. Ultimately, in the face of BMW being placed in the nightmarish situation of potentially being the ones responsible for closing down Rover, and thus being solely to blame for the company's downfall by the public and press, A last-minute saviour for the deal came on May 7, 2000, when the First Union Bank of North Carolina agreed to back the Phoenix Consortium with £200 million of working capital, a move considered to have been made in secret at the behest of BMW itself, as their main production facility for the United States just so happened to be at Spartanburg in the neighbouring South Carolina, and was a major employer both north and south of the state line. This injection of much-needed backing securing the future of the deal, and the following day BMW's lawyers signed on the dotted line, Rover being handed to Phoenix for a nominal sum of just £10, while, in return, receiving £500 million from BMW that would cover the cost of redundancies and company restructuring, the future direction of the newly founded MG-Rover company being essentially a facsimile of the plan proposed by the Alchemy partnership, but with a lower annual production output, the MG brand being expanded through its introduction onto regular Rover saloon cars and hatchbacks, while John Towers, the leader of the Phoenix Consortium, was paraded at Longbridge as the hero of the hour. What Phoenix had bought, however, was a much downsized firm to what the Rover Group had been 54 days earlier, BMW having taken with them both the new Mini, the Mini Mark itself, the Cowley plant, and the intellectual rights to the Rover R30 project, Land Rover having been sold to Ford at a cost of £1.5 billion, bringing into their power the Solihull plant and the luxurious Range Rover marque that was soon to be refreshed with the next generation L322, while what assets remained at MG-Rover included one assembly plant at Longbridge and the production rights to the original Mini design, the Rover 25, the Rover 45, the Rover 75, and the MGF Roadster. BMW also providing to Phoenix a £492 million soft loan that would be repayable after 50 years, or if the MG-Rover firm ever hit profitability, whichever came first. The most important objective being to revitalise interest in the firm's ageing product list, and thus, taking a leaf from the book of the Alchemy Partnership, each of the company's current models were hastily re-engineered by Rob Alderker, Product Development Director of MG-Rover and Managing Director of MG Sport and Racing, to create the MG ZR, ZS and ZT, each of which were rebadged and restyled Rover 25, 45 and 75 family cars with reworked chassis engineering and power plant tuning that emulated British Leyland's efforts for MG during the early 1980s, wherein the MG badge, after the discontinuation of the dedicated MGB and midget sports cars, was applied to slightly modified versions of the Austin Metro, Maestro and Montego. Each of these new MG models being merely stopgaps before the company invested in an entirely new breed of MG model, the RDX60 concept of January 2002. A stylish mid-range model with sporting aspirations that would be based on the running gear of the Rover 75-derived MG ZT and be ready for launch by early 2004, but due to the company's lack of major financial strength for research and development, had to be outsourced to Tom Wilkinshaw Racing or TWR so as to make it ready for mass assembly. In the meantime, the space cleared at Longbridge through the outsourcing of the RDX60 was taken up developing two products which were to be marketed as their own original cars, but were in fact either bought or license-produced by Rover from other companies. The first being the MG X-Power SV, which had started life originally in 1996 as the DiTomaso Bigua, a concept sports car based on the underpinnings of the 1993 Ford Mustang GT. But following a souring of relations between Alejandro DiTomaso and former DiTomaso North American dealer Gel Cavale, who was helping to finance the project, the former abandoned the scheme and thus allowed Cavale to release the model under his own name as the Mangusta, MG-Rover eventually paying £10 million in order to acquire the rights to the ailing Cavale supercar company during 2002, and thus launching Project X80, a 175-mile-an-hour sports car that would go head-to-head with the likes of the TVR Tuscan Speed 6, and was scheduled for launch in 2004, while at the same time, a deal was struck with the Tata Steel Company of India to produce a Rover-badged version of their Indica Super Mini that would be dubbed the City Rover, a spiritual successor to the Austin Metro, though in reality, the City Rover proved to be a serious bone of contention for the MG-Rover firm, as the cars were originally assembled as the Indica at the Tata plant in Pune, India, before being bought by Rover for £3,000 per unit and shipped to Longbridge, whereupon the suspension would be revised and the frontal design altered to accommodate a Rover badge and grille. The City Rover eventually being launched onto the UK market in the autumn of 2003 at a base price of £6,495, essentially meaning that the British buyer was paying an additional £3,495 for a badge and nothing else. The release of the car being met with strong and vocal outrage from all areas of the UK public and press, which only served to severely damage the car's commercial performance, which fell way below expected forecasts. Worse still was the collapse of TWR in mid-2003, following a highly expensive price war the company had waged when purchasing the Arrows Formula One team in 1996. thus seeing the closure of the former Daewoo Worthing Technical Centre, where the RDX-60 was undergoing development, meaning this crucially important project had to be put on hold, while another corporate partner was sought in order to help bring the scheme to fruition, with one of the first considerations being Fiat, who offered the use of their underperforming Stilo platform as the basis for the new car, though this was ultimately rejected by the MG-Rover management. Other attempts to garner assistance coming through a potential joint venture with French industrial conglomerate Matra, who were the parent of Renault, and led to early discussions as to creating a Rover-badged version of the third-generation Renault Espace people carrier, though this, like other possible long-term tie-ups with Tata Steel and Proton of Malaysia, also fell through, the company's only recourse being to strike a deal with Chinese car maker China Brilliance Industrial Holdings or CBIH. But again, this partnership also collapsed when, after paying MG-Rover around £50 million, the Chinese firm walked away from further discussions to instead establish a joint venture with BMW. Amid the collapse of TWR and the inability for MG-Rover to find a suitable partner to complete the RDX-60 project, the most damning incident occurred during November 2003, when it emerged that the four main partners who had created the Phoenix Consortium had set up a private pension fund for themselves and their families, dubbed the Phoenix 4 Pension Fund, which, together with MG-Rover Managing Director Kevin Ho, awarded each of the four men, John Towers, Peter Beale, Nick Stevenson and John Edwards, a sum subtracted from the company's profits that amounted to £12.9 million, while at the same time, details were made public as to how these management figures had been in discussion with St Modwen, a Birmingham-based property developer, to sell them the Longbridge plant, a move that, in combination with the general slowdown in production output over the course of 2003 and into 2004, saw the Phoenix Consortium labelled by a baying national press as asset strippers, this public relations catastrophe seeing sales collapse, while the release of new products such as the MG-ZT V8 and the X-Power SV supercar were largely ignored in the face of this terrible scandal, although regardless of this fallout, in June 2004, it was announced that MG-Rover were in early discussions as to a possible tie-up with the Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation or SAIC, possibly saving the future yet again for the firm as its capital dwindled down to the last million. The announcement of the SAIC discussions were followed by details as to what the deal would entail, comprising a joint venture between the two car makers that would see Rover products built in both China and at Longbridge. But as the ironing out of the deal's various aspects moved into late 2004, the spiralling losses incurred at Longbridge meant line workers did whatever they could to stave off fiscal collapse, working as hard as they could to produce as many cars as possible, regardless of whether they sold, with the runways of airfields across Britain becoming inundated with Rover 25s, 45s and 75s that nobody wanted. All hope now resting on the prospect of SAIC signing up to the joint venture, which would amount to an estimated sum of £1 billion, while to smooth things over with the Chinese builder, MG-Rover executives handed them the intellectual property rights to the Rover 25 and 75, the MGTF, and the K-Series engine for a derisory sum of just £67 million. The proposed date of the deal's signature, originally scheduled for January 2005, being pushed back time after time as SAIC executives went over the details of MG-Rover's finances and future prospects, eventually leading, amid the planned shipment of production for the Rover 25, the Rover Streetwise, the MG-ZR, and the K-Series engine to Shanghai, to an emergency meeting being called at the end of March 2005 that saw SAIC get cold feet about the proposed buyout of MG-Rover due to its terrible finances and a lack of progress regarding the RDX-60 scheme, the Chinese company unwilling to take on such a loss-maker, and despite MG-Rover managers, as well as executives from the Department of Trade and Industry, flying out to Shanghai to try and rebuild their confidence, SAIC walked away. With their last saviour having forsaken them, MG-Rover ceased trading on April 7, 2005, with the official administrator, PricewaterhouseCoopers or PwC, moving in the following day to salvage what they could and sell the rest at bankruptcy auction, the 4,500 remaining workers being laid off a week later, and the British auto industry meeting its final demise, just under 100 years after the formation of the original Austin Motor Company in December 1905. PwC working through April, June and July to find a buyer for the remaining assets of the now deceased MG-Rover, and from over 200 keenly interested parties, the overall winner was the Nanjing Automobile Group of China, who acquired some assets of MG-Rover Group and Powertrain Limited, as well as the Longbridge plant, and the intellectual rights to the Austin Motor Company name, NAG taking on the production technology and equipment for the MG-ZT and MGTF models, but were forced to give up the blueprints and materials for the Rover 45 and MG-ZS, as these were the intellectual property of Honda. The revived MG motor, established on April 12, 2006, restarting production of the MGF in a small section of the Longbridge plant following an investment of £53 million by the Chinese builder, while the former Rover 75 and MG-ZT saloon will be produced in China as either the MG-7 or the Roadway 750, ultimately leading to the first brand new MG car, the MG-6, being launched in June 2011, although by this point, NAG had been purchased by SAIC Motor and was also released on the domestic Chinese market as the Roadway 550. The MG range continuing to expand through a wide variety of models, including compact sports hatchbacks, saloons, and even crossover SUVs, although production at its former home of Longbridge would not last, with MG announcing in September 2016 that all MG car assembly at the former Austin factory would be transferred to new plants in China and later Thailand, though by this point much of the Longbridge plant had been torn down during 2007 and 2008 so as to make room for real estate projects within Longbridge town centre. The final operational sections of the plant, including the last surviving assembly buildings, Cab 1, Cab 2 and the paint shop, being dismantled throughout early to mid-2020, leaving the only remaining structure of the once grand home base of Britain's car industry being the iconic Technical and Design Centre, which is now used as a showroom, and MG domestic offices specialising in research and development of future models. In summary, the history of the British motor industry and its protracted collapse is a nuanced case that had its seeds sown very early on in its history, with an initial bitter rivalry between the two chairmen of the nation's largest car firms, leading to an era of pervasive distrust when said corporations were forced together in an unhappy union, each workforce and management striving to outdo one another even though they were now part of the same company, and starting a vicious cycle that would repeat throughout the course of the following decades, the reality being that no amount of money, be it private or state funding, could have divorced the running of British Leyland or indeed its successors from the mindset that gradually consumed and ultimately destroyed its place on the world stage, with the efforts and ambitions of Sir Michael Edwards, Graham Day, and even Bernd Pichetsrider of BMW, all men determined to turn a basket case into a self-sustaining car maker, doing nothing but prolonging the inevitable, and in the face of too many opposing forces, vested interests, ambivalent powers, and scandalous affairs, nothing could prevent what ultimately became of British Leyland, the Rover Group, and MG-Rover. And now, as other car-building nations flourish and adapt to suit the needs of global economics and environmental challenges, the UK auto industry can only be found in history books, as a long and cautionary tale of how not to run a car company.